At the beginning of the semester, we talked about the 6 language arts, and to refresh your memory, those include reading, writing, speaking, listening, visually representing, and viewing. So in today's two-part lecture about visual literacy, we're going to address the language arts area of viewing. So viewing actually corresponds with Anchor Standard 7 under Reading, Literature, and Informational Text for the Common Core State Standards. Anchor Standard 7 specifies that students need to be able to evaluate information presented visually. So today what we're going to do is actually talk about different ways that you can analyze photographs. So let's start by talking about codes. So a code is any sort of a sign that has meaning to people. For example, there are some codes on this slide that might be quite familiar to a lot of you. For example, when we see this, we know that this usually signifies a women's restroom. This here is a universal sign for choking. This is a pause symbol, and it's something that we probably see very frequently on remote controls. A peace sign is also quite familiar. This stands for poison, and we often see this on labels of poisonous substances, so we know that we need to remove such items from children and pets. If you're a fan of the Grateful Dead, you would recognize these dancing bears. And likewise, if you're a fan of the Rolling Stones, which is a great band, by the way, you would recognize this as one of their symbols. So these are all examples of codes. They are all signs that have specific meanings. So when we talk about codes, there are 3 different kinds. We have written codes, and those are probably most familiar to us. Those include things like letters, words, sentences, paragraphs, captions, speech bubbles, things like that. Those are quite familiar. Then we have symbolic codes, which include things like objects, setting, body language, and clothing color. And then we also have technical codes that include things like how photographs are framed, as well as the type of lighting and exposure that we see in photographs. And we're going to talk a lot about those technical codes in this lecture, because I imagine that these codes are probably less familiar to you than perhaps written codes. But before we begin talking about those technical codes, let's spend some time talking about symbolic codes. And your textbook does talk about this a good deal. For example, your textbook on, I think, page 56, no, sorry, I think it's page 155, talks a lot about symbolic codes such as color. So if we look at this image, we can read the symbolic codes in order to help us determine what is happening. And this image that we see here might be familiar to you already, but let's, for a moment step back and assume that you don't know anything about who these people are and what's going on in this photograph. We can read this photograph by thinking about the symbolic codes. Like, let's look at the colors that people are wearing. So according to our textbook, the color white is a color that symbolizes innocence and cleanliness. And this woman here is wearing a white dress. And in our culture, in Western culture, typically white is worn by brides. In other cultures, like Eastern cultures, actually I think brides sometimes wear red instead of white. Different cultures have different traditions, but within our culture, white is a symbolic code that stands for innocence, and it's something that brides often wear. So we can guess by, the veil that she's wearing and the really poofy sleeves and lacy dress that she is probably a bride, because ordinary people don't usually wear clothing like this on a regular basis. Even people who are not ordinary, like very wealthy people or people with a lot of power in society don't normally dress like this. So we can tell that this is a special occasion. We can also see a lot of gold in this picture. We can see it on this gentleman's hat here, as well as its, trim along his cuff. We see it here in what they're riding in. And gold is actually a symbolic code that stands for like wealth and extravagance. So when we see gold, we tend to think, oh, this is very luxe. So you can infer by interpreting that symbolic code of the color gold that these people probably have a lot of money. They're probably people of importance. So we can look at those symbolic codes. We can also look at their body language. So it looks like these people are looking out and waving at other people. And the way that they are waving, just kind of their hands up and kind of almost as if their hands are kind of still. They're not vigorously waving their arms. To me suggests that they might be very reserved, perhaps very shy and private people. I know that when I wave at people, I wave a lot more vigorously and enthusiastically, and I probably make myself look like a fool. But those people are clearly not waving in the style that, you know, we tend to see in the United States, commonly anyway. So I can infer that these folks might be very private people, very reserved people. So the fact that they're waving to others signifies that this might be a special event, or they might be people of importance, or perhaps they're just greeting somebody that they know. I can also see that they are riding in something. This does not look like a car. It actually looks like some sort of a carriage. If you kind of look at the back, that doesn't really look like a car to me. So I'm guessing that this is probably a special occasion, because usually you don't ride around in a carriage on an everyday basis. I know that at one point in time, decades past, riding around in a carriage was a very common way of getting around. But today it's really not very common whatsoever. So usually people only ride in carriages like for special occasions, or if they're tourists in, you know, big cities and they get a horse-drawn carriage ride or something like that. So that's what I can read by looking at the symbolic codes in this picture. And I do have background information about this picture, and you likely do as well. You probably recognize these people as Prince Charles and Princess Diana on their wedding day in the early 1980s. So even if you didn't know that, you could still read a lot about what's happening in this picture by considering the symbolic codes. Alright, so now we're going to shift our discussion to technical codes, which might be less familiar to you unless you've taken a class in like film study or mass communication. You know, you might not have been exposed to this information before, but this is actually interesting information because it can help you interpret photographs and other visual images, things like movies, TV shows, and whatnot. And I think that knowing this information is worthwhile, not just because it's, you know, it aligns with the standard in Common Core, but I also think it can just enhance your appreciation of visual images, especially since visual images are just everywhere in our society. So I think that this is pretty interesting stuff, at least it is to me. So camera angle communicates different messages. So when we see a low angle shot, meaning a shot that was taken, the photographer is actually lower than the subject of the photo, like we see here with this boy standing up. This is a low angle shot. It tends to make the subject of the photograph look very powerful. So when we see images shot in this way, we know that the photographer is trying to, you know, put the subject in a position of power. On the other hand, high angle shots in which the photographer is shooting the image from above the subject can actually make the subject look a lot more insignificant. It kind of makes the subject look small and weak. It certainly has the opposite effect of a low angle shot like we see here. So framing is another technical code to consider. So when we see close-up images of people, like we see here, this tends to convey a sense of intimacy. It also tends to lend a sense of power to the subject of the photograph. We are face to face with that, with the subject of the photo. And you know, these are both good examples of a close-up frame and then a wide-angle frame. And unlike a close-up frame, a wide-angle frame like this one actually gives us some separation or some distance between ourselves as viewers of the image and the subject of the photograph. So I actually chose photos of Lindsay Lohan that I found online for both of these, so you could see how images of the same person could look so dramatically different and kind of give us a different feel as, you know, viewers of the image based on how the image is framed. And this image is also pretty interesting because it's interesting to kind of look at the symbolic codes operating here, like the fact that she's got long hair, that she's tousling with her hands and her mouth's open. It seems to convey I think this image is intended to be very sensual. I don't remember what it's from, but I would not be surprised if it's an ad for something like perfume or makeup or something like that. Alright, then we have depth of field. And when we have a shallow depth of field, usually the subject at the forefront of the image is the only aspect of the photo that's actually in focus. And the effect that this has is that the subject of the photograph, in this case the squirrel that we see here, is commanding our attention. That's where our eyes are directed. So when we want to draw attention to a particular aspect of a photograph, we can use a shallow depth of field. And on the other hand, when we have a deep depth of field, all of the objects in the background are all in equal focus. So there's no one part of the photograph that really really demands your attention, like we see with the squirrel here in this photograph demonstrating the shallow depth of field. And then another technical code is lighting. So when lighting in a photograph is bright, like we see here in this image of Jeff Bridges accepting an Academy Award, at least I think that's what it is, you know, we get a sense of clarity and openness in that particular photograph. On the other hand, when the lighting of a photograph is very dark, it tends to convey a sense of mischief or deviousness, because usually we associate dark colors with like evil or a sense of malice sometimes. Actually, it's quite interesting. If you Google images of Disney villains, you'll begin to notice that most of the Disney villains like have things like a black mustache or black hair, and they tend to wear clothing that is very darkly colored, but we don't really see that in you know, with the protagonists of like Disney films. But when we look at the villains, black is a really common color that we see on like their clothing and hair. So that's pretty interesting if you want to take time to look at that. But we can certainly see that a dark lighting has the effect of making Jeff Bridges in this photograph seem really mysterious, like he perhaps has a secret that he's hiding. And in fact, that was the intent in this photograph, because I believe this was a promotional photo for the movie The Giver, in which I believe, I haven't seen the movie, I've read the book, but I think in the movie Jeff Bridges does take on the role as the Giver, who is a very mysterious figure to most living in the community. So the fact that he's being portrayed in this very dark lighting actually makes a lot of sense given the nature of his role in the movie. So those are, you know, it's a quick overview, but those are some technical codes. And in part 2 of this lecture, we're going to take a look at how we can apply our knowledge of these technical codes to analyzing a photograph.